do with this is, in a non-destructive way, is ground penetrating radar. Because what you don't want to do is go and disturb people's graves unnecessarily. So ground penetrating radar offers a quick, cost-effective, and non-destructive, that's so important, way for finding unmarked graves or potentially unmarked graves. It's non-invasive in that you don't have to dig into the soil at all. And basically, all it requires is a couple of pieces of equipment, a transmitter and a receiving antenna. The transmitter, which you can see on this cart right here, which is basically the base of like a jogging stroller that you use for children, that the equipment set up on that. And you can run it across the graveyard in linear transects. So what it does is it basically shoots electromagnetic energy into the ground surface, right? It emits a pulse into the ground, and it records the echoes that bounce off of different objects. So that way you'll be able to see if there are differences in the soil stratigraphy or large impediments like rocks, or areas where the soil is different, where maybe an area has been excavated out and then refilled back in. Because if you think about it, right, if you're digging something like a grave or any kind of hole, you're taking the soil out of its natural stratigraphy, piling it up, and then replacing it. So when it goes back in, it's all jumbled. It's no longer in those neat layers that it originally was. So it's going to bounce back a different signal than the surrounding intact soils, basically. So it can pick up, the normal stratigraphic variation. You'll see that, as well as disturbances, both natural and cultural. So it can find things like rocks and tree throws, but also things like cellar holes and potentially gravestones. People use it to find buried utilities. It has a lot of different uses. But what you really get with this is a map of disturbances and anomalies, right? It can't tell you for sure generally what they are. So it really does require ground truthing to be certain. And that would mean excavation. But in this case, just the idea that there were definitely areas that could have been graves basically answered the questions that we had. So, your field methods for ground penetrating radar is you establish a grid over the ground surface, the area that you want to test. In this case, we ran tape measures going in along the two sides of the cemetery. And then we ran the machine over overlapping transects measuring about 50 centimeters wide. So you go across, bring it back, and do the next one. It's really important to go in the same direction. This is a thing that the Office of State Archaeology does. We have a good working relationship with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, and the state soil scientist, Debbie Sarabian, and she is the GPR expert, and she works on these projects with us as part of this relationship. So it's a thing that we're able to do to help people figure out cemetery situations basically free of charge. So in order to maintain those straight lines, we use a rope going back and forth across the grid, and she follows it. And then you have two people on either side that move the rope to the next 50 centimeter mark, and she does it again. So it's kind of a tedious process, but it enables her to get a good picture of the entire area. And in this case, because it was a small cemetery, we were able to do the entire cemetery. So this is basically what the data looks like when you get it back. It requires expertise and special kinds of software to process and interpret the data. But basically what you're seeing here is a profile of the soils in the graveyard, okay? So here, I've just got a version of a typical soil profile in New England. You've got the grass on the top, the A is the topsoil, the B is the subsoil, the C is the glacial horizon, and below that is the bedrock. And that's reflected in the GPR profile as well. So here in the middle, you've got this area here is your A and B. You can see this rocky area with the glacial. You're getting these marks, see the red and yellow. It's picking up the rocks and the cobbles in that layer. And then down here, you have the bedrock, which is another rock layer. So in this profile, you can see a couple of breaks in the stratigraphic sequence. And that suggests that that was disturbed, right? That somebody had dug in there, pulled the soil out, and put it back in a different configuration. It's a break in the natural soil. So that's a good indicator of a potential grave shaft. You can also see the data in plan or in 2 dimensions, so kind of looking down from the top, like this aerial view of the cemetery. This is the data from the GPR at several different depths. So you have 40 centimeters, 60, 80, and 100. And if you can see the areas where the red and gray are, that's where it's getting different readings. And you know, in her report, Debbie noted the linear kind of configurations of these red and gray marks, suggesting rows of potential graves. Okay, so that's the kind of data that we're looking at. It's not, you know, it's not like a glass bottom boat. You can't see into the ground and see exactly what's going on, but it's giving us a sense of what may be there based on the soil anomalies. So in terms of interpreting the results, you know, her report suggested strong potential for additional unmarked burials in the cemetery, particularly in the rear of the cemetery. And what she said in her report, and I'll quote her here, this is an interpretation of GPR data and has not been ground truth by archaeologists. The actual number of burials within the cemetery could be more or less than 25. So we have 9 marked ones. There's the potential for significantly more, basically. When she talks about ground truthing, in this case, what that would mean would not be digging down and digging up graves, but it would be a situation where you might scrape off the topsoil and look for evidence of those burial features. It's something that could be done. So historic burial features, you know, you can see these cuts in the soil, right? These are outlined, but that's basically these soil stains. When you scrape off the topsoil, you're seeing the outline of the hole that someone dug and then filled back in. The dirt is a different color because it's all mixed up, right? It's not just the same color as the surrounding substrate. You can also look at socioeconomic standing in terms of comparison to other sites in a particular time and place, right? You have this body of material at one house. How does it compare with this other house over here? Does it look like these people had more money, less money, were engaged in different activities, etc.? And looking at the materials at a particular site over time. If a site's occupied for a long period of time, do you see a shift in materials as the family may have gained or lost wealth over time? Do they start out having really nice stuff and then, you know, 30 or 40 years later have kind of more inexpensive stuff and less material? And then does that correlate then with what you can find out from the documents about their economic status? We're going to sort of archaeology for the documents and the artifacts, that interplay between them to inform each other. That's what gives us the fuller, richer picture of what's going on. And that's why historical archaeology is really exciting in a lot of ways. Another thing you can look at through material culture is identity. How do people express themselves through their material possessions? That can be in terms of class, ethnicity, religion, all kinds of different things. So I put up just a couple of examples on here. You don't often get artifacts that say, yes, this is how I think about myself. It's oftentimes you have to look at the bigger picture and kind of think of it that way. But there are sometimes artifacts that really do speak to identity.
We're dealing with historic African Americans who came here in bondage and as disenfranchised populations. You know, many times because Native Americans at this time were now being enslaved also, and as disenfranchised populations, they gathered together many times, you know, intermarriages, but also living in communities together. So what I want to do is just give you kind of that African American archaeology that has been done in the state of Connecticut, give you kind of a survey of it. And I call it hidden in plain sight, simply because sometimes, as Sarah pointed out with the archaeology that was done in Nightingale Woods, that it's not always very clear who's who until you either have the documentation or do the archaeology in the ground. So it's actually there. And another thing about that is too, you need to also look at these sites. You know, as Warren Perry, who's an African American archaeologist at Central Connecticut State University, has always said to me, you have to look at these sites through African eyes. You have to see it through their dimensions and their cultural background, as opposed to, you know, our perspective coming in. So here's just a quick little list of some of the sites, some of which I'll be talking about, some of which have no archaeological work having done. But these are sites and places where African American heritage have been found. Little Liberia in Bridgeport, which is a whole neighborhood of freed African Americans right into the 19th century. Little Egypt in Reading, Connecticut. This is a place that almost nobody knows about. It's actually on water company property in Reading, Connecticut, in the western part of our state. And you can go down walking through the woods, sometimes old dirt roads, and you'll see foundations and so forth. And many people would assume that they were probably a Euro-American community, but actually when you do the research, you find out it was an African-American community dating back to as early as 1820s, 1810s, so that this was before Connecticut, which was basically the last New England state to prohibit slavery. The landscape is there, the changes are there, they have different cultural heritages to them and are defined if you can understand and read those. Grotier Furrow, who is better known in New England as Venture Smith, we have 3 sites associated with that, one individual and his family, and I'll tell you more about it when we talk about the sites. But we have his homestead in Haddam, Connecticut, of earlier homestead that he occupied in Stonington, Connecticut, when he was a captive of some of the families there, and his burial site in East Haddam that I got to work many, many years ago with Warren Perry. Black governors' houses in Derby, Connecticut have been excavated. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Colonel Brown's property in Salem, Connecticut. And of course, I'm still calling the Lost Village, but Nightingale Woods here. And when Sarah gave you better detail about the properties there and whether they are associated with African Americans. So, not having to get into a lot of this because Sarah really covered it extremely well, but understand the archaeological record is kind of we like to think non-biased, where the written record has, depends on who's writing that story, and not everybody's story is being told. African Americans have long been underrepresented in the historical record. We have few accounts. When we do have accounts, many times they're biased by the authors of those accounts. But we like to think archaeological evidence preserves class, gender, or educational levels. We're all represented out there. And it's a question of interpreting and understanding that better. And as Warren has told me, taught me, you have to look at it through African eyes. The thing about the Freeman houses is that they're the oldest extant houses still standing, even though, as you can see, they're in very rough condition, built by African Americans for African Americans and only occupied by African Americans, and in this case, the Freeman family. So they're very significant, and there's a huge effort going on, and it has been going on for a number of years, to raise funds to restore these houses so they can not only be refurbished, but also serve as a museum, understanding more about Little Liberia. People hardly know it existed, but it's very important. The Black Governor's houses in Derby, Connecticut. This is part of Osborne-Dale State Park. The excavations were done here by Warren Perry. In fact, he spent a number of field seasons there. And Black governors, if you don't know who they were sometimes called Black kings. And what they were in African American communities, they were allowed to elect their own officials that would represent them with the more dominant society around them. And they functioned in a number of ways. They headed events, they resolved conflicts, they advocated for the Native American community with a larger Euro-American community. But they played important roles. Some of it was ceremonial, but much of it was political and economic and helping the community through. And in this case, Quash and Roswell Freeman occupied a house in Derby. And it was occupied by the same family for over 110 years. And Warren Perry and Anthony Martin conducted excavations. You see, for 8 years, they brought the Central Connecticut State University Field School down there, and conducted excavations around the house. You can see these are excavation units in the back of the house, really trying to get at what the Freemans had and who they were, that identity. The reason we could do that identity is because when you go back to this time period, you go back to the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century especially, people broadcast their garbage around the house. It didn't go very far. They didn't have a great deal of material culture as we think of it today. And things get broadcasted around the house. So as a result, when you do the archaeology, you can do the archaeology of the Freeman family. And it's the same with the families in, Nightingale Woods. You can do their archaeology. Think about us. We can't do that with us. Because our populations are so large, our properties are so small, we can't broadcast our garbage. It has to be taken away from us and sent to a landfill where it is then all deposited together. Some is recycled, it's exchanged. But the point is, in future years, when archaeologists excavate you and I, they're going to have a hard time finding the identity of the Palatoni family. But what they will have is a new focus regionally. They'll be able to look at us as communities, as maybe even municipalities or regions. But individually, our identity is going to be blurred because your garbage is mixed with my garbage. And when we get back to African American history and archaeology, it's also above ground, not just below ground. Because many times captives lived in the same houses sometimes as their owners. Sometimes they had separate dwellings. But in some cases, they lived right in the same houses, often in attics or in the basements. And so what we see sometimes in these historic houses are carvings, markings, that can be associated with the African American occupants of, not a very good slide, but this is actually from Old Trinity Church in Brooklyn, Connecticut, not too far from here, guys. This was up in the, if you will, the gallery or the balcony, because people of color weren't allowed to sit with the congregation on the main floor of the church. They were placed up in the balconies and the galleries. And this is from one of the wooden pews up in the back where the chairs were, where they carved a bird in the lower let's see, I'm trying to get lower left, and up on top, there's a carving of a ship. Maybe depicting the ship that brought them here at the time. By the way, in some cases, in these early churches where people of color were placed in the upper balconies to be away, in some cases, those balconies were boarded up higher so the white congregation did not have to see the congregation of color. They were blocked off completely, allowed in the church, but in their separate place, and in some cases, visually blocked off so that the congregation, the white congregation, wouldn't have to see them. And probably the foremost, the one that we've had a lot of archaeology has been done for an individual is complex, and that is Bertier Venture Smith. He was called Venture because the person that bought him, Robinson Mumford, who purchased him from Rhode Island, this was the first time Mumford had ventured into the slave trade, and so Venture became his name. He was born, think around certainly in the 1720s, someplace in West Africa. He was a prince in his tribe. His father was a chief within the chieftain system. He was sold into slavery by warring factions of other tribes, and as a young man, and went on that that horrendous middle voyage, middle passage coming to North America. Because he was purchased en route by Mumford, he was not let off in Barbados and other areas of the Caribbean, where most of the human cargo was deployed, but actually came to New England, where he was held captive. He was captive in Rhode Island, New York, especially on Long Island, and Connecticut. Very entrepreneurish, very hardworking man. He came out of a tradition in Africa where leaders, if you will, that accumulated wealth, but not for themselves, as we think of in our society, in a capitalistic society. You accumulate wealth within your families or within your households. But wealth was to be distributed. It was to be sent out. It was to be given to everyone. And the chiefs kind of served as the focal point of the redistribution of that wealth. And he was kind of the same way. He took that concept here into capitalism. He accumulated wealth basically by working, not only for Pomfret and later on Smith, Colonel Smith, which he derived his last name from. But he would work on the side as an entrepreneur. He would do extra workings. He had to give his owners, because he didn't own his own body, and he didn't own a portion of what he made, but he saved his money, and he built it up. And what he did is he offered his own money to buy his own freedom. He was, for 30 years, he was a slave, but he then raised enough money where he could purchase his freedom from Colonel Smith, and why he took the name Venture Smith after him. He becomes he's shipping, he's involved in shipping, he's involved in quarrying, he's involved in farming, he's a merchant, and he buys the freedom of his wife, he buys the freedom of his sons and daughter, he buys the freedom of other black men. He has a property in Haddam Neck. And eventually, in his old age, he would narrate his story to a teacher, and you could read that story online today as the narrative of Venture Smith. He died in 1805 at the age of 77. There's 4 graves here. Venture Smith on the far side. His wife Beth, his son Solomon, and his granddaughter Eliza. For privacy, they put us up kind of a wedding tent. It's kind of nice because it gave us some privacy, but boy was it hot in there. And you can see the tombstones and how we work. Before we even put a shovel in the ground, before we even started this, we had the family come in for commemoration. And not only was there a ceremony at the First Congregational Church, but also we had a ceremony conducted of African spiritualism, of blessing the area, preparing the area for the uncovering of the ancestors. There's Warren, who was co-director with myself on the project, and we set up our archaeological grid. In this case, the grid is of different dimensions, because we wanted to see if there are any artifacts specific to the tombstones themselves. That grid was set up to specifically recover and document artifacts in those areas. And then the longer rectangular grid was for the burials themselves as we went down behind each of the tombstones. And you can see the footstones that Ruthie was talking about behind the headstone area. Myself and Jerry Sawyer working on getting down deeper into the grave. This is actually Venture Smith's coffin. The soil here in this cemetery in East Haddam, the soils were very acidic, that is to say, very low in the pH, and as a result, organic remains did not do very well. We found literally no bone, no wood, other than what was adhering to nails and so forth. So it turned out it looked pretty unsuccessful. I point out that when you see the red flags are where we found hardware and nails associated. It's kind of a plain coffin, but it did have, and I'll show you in a moment, a hinge associated with it. It is a very big coffin. It is over 6 feet in length. It is almost 3 feet in diameter. That is large. And it turns out that Venture Smith was very large. He, not only in social stature, I like to think, but his physical stature. We know he was 6 foot tall, and some accounts say that he weighed almost 300 pounds. He was a big, strong, sturdy individual, and that plays out. This is a hinge from the coffin, so that you could open the face, the head of the coffin, so you can view his face without having to lift the entire region. And here you can see the outline of the graves as we uncovered them laying next to each other, not always in a clean formation as the tombstones indicate, but there nonetheless. So as I said, because of poor organic conditions, we had no skeletal remains until we were working his wife's Meg's grave. And then I started to find this little white speck that was coming through the soil. And I wasn't sure quite at first what I was looking at. You can see here we have masks on and surgical gloves, and that's not for health purposes. There's no real health issues with these kind of excavations. But if we did find bone, we wanted to be sure we did not contaminate the sample. And so archaeologists breathing and handling skeletal remains could transfer their own DNA onto the specimen. So, they do the DNA and they find out that Benjamin Smith is from Italy. I'm in a lot of trouble. So we try to protect ourselves and, make sure we don't contaminate the sample. But as I worked that stain, it became linear. And what I believe it is part of the arm bone of Meg, his wife. And we call it Meg's gift because in African tradition and African American, it's the mother. It's the mother who gives the gifts. She bestows upon the family. And she gave us this gift that we were able to get out of the ground. You can see here Warren holding it with, these are graduate students from the University of Connecticut genetic labs. It was frozen immediately and put into the laboratories. Unfortunately, it was so decomposed that at this point, we were not able to get any good DNA markers. However, we're holding that sample. Technology's improved on the road. We are hoping that we'll still be able to extract that.
Technically, we all use the word cemetery, but burying grounds and cemeteries are two separate things. Burying grounds are pre-1800, cemeteries are post-1800. Burying grounds are, you lived, you died, you had a right to be buried. Gravestones are another whole subject. In cemeteries, it is now a business. We're making money, we're pre-planning, we're selling plots, etc., etc., etc. Gravestones always had a headstone and a footstone, always. It isn't until the 1800s that things start to change. Think of it just like you were lying in a bed, a headboard and a footboard, you're in a bed. And that is how it's meant to be. Now, the other side, as far as the directional side of which way everything faces, Puritan times, everything evolved around Gabriel blowing that horn and calling God's army forth on that morning of judgment when that sun rises. The sun rises in the east, folks. If you are going to rise forward and go forth, then your feet better be to the east, yes? Tories were often buried backwards as a punishment to rise to the west. I am not sure yet what that punishment really was, except that by the time they got up, dusted themselves off, and went forward, they would be last in line. That's my joke for the day. Witches were often buried face down, assuming that they would not be able to rise. So in the first 100 years, this positioning matters a whole lot. The writing on the gravestone faces the original entrance of that cemetery. And I emphasize the original because this is a perfect example. When you come in the cemetery, I'm looking at the backs of all the stones. The idea is where the original entrance in that first acre was, and then the cemetery grew gradually every so many years around it. You have these table stones, okay? Table stones weren't for your average farmers. Table stones were for people that were doctors, ministers, lawyers, people with influence over your society. So the minute you walk into an old burying ground, you know right away who those important people are, yes? And when you get into Victorian times, then the important people get the big center monuments and people are buried around them. So your Puritan stones had to be blank, had to be, we don't want to create any real artistic stuff going on because that's, vanity there, that's the word I want, vanity. So these are two examples of early stones made by the Stancliffe family. You didn't pre-plan these things. The person died, then you'd have to figure out, can I afford a stone? Where can I get a stone? What are we gonna put on the stone? And like I tell the kids, it's not like we picked up the phone and made a phone call. You're talking Pony Express. No one got a gravestone the year they died. I don't think anybody did. It took a minimum of 2-3 years or so to make these arrangements, make it work. Most of your carvers would carve in the winter when they weren't taking care of their own farms. They would use their winter time to fill the orders. You would have to wait until springtime to be able to travel to bring the stone to the cemetery and set it in proper ground. Because your stones from up north towards Springfield area are much denser and different than your stones coming out of Portland, or stones coming from a quarry in Southington. There are differences in these stones which need to be paid attention to as time goes on. Mr. Collins was one of our early carvers in this area. He was pretty much in the Columbia area, but you can find his stones out through Woodstock and all the way through Tom and Wyndham County, and mostly the works that he did. But he got quite intricate in his early works, quite intricate with all the designs and everything. Now this isn't a slate stone, this is what I call a schist mix. It's a very early granite, and that seemed to be what he liked to use for most of his works. You have what you call wolf stones. Now wolf stones, this one has a lot of writing on it, but a wolf stone is a rough stone. When you first see this, you need to check and make sure that it's not a table stone where the legs have broken and it has fallen into the ground, because that's a possibility, and I've found those before. However, a wolf stone is thinner, rough cut, not fancy. It's put over a grave for that reason, that the wolves will not dig up the body. That is the reason for it. Now, because they're flat in the ground, they easily become overgrown, covered up, disappear.
We're currently working in about 30 cemeteries throughout Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Those all start as neglected cemeteries and/or cemeteries that aren't neglected, but the stones need cleaning and/or repairs. And to me, it's not just about what you see above ground. You see people look on Find a Grave, and that you see these pictures and all the information. That's a great starting point, but it's also what is underground, where Lisa will do a lot of our stone cleanings in Kingdom Well as well. I'm a mole. I will get on my hands and feet in the ground, and I'm digging sometimes up to 2 feet to find the stones, and we've been able to save many of stones because of that.
So the first material I'm going to go over is going to be slate, which is not indigenous to Connecticut, however is widespread in other states, including Vermont, especially Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The stone that is above here is actually from the Boston region, and it's right over in the Abington Cemetery, not too far down the road. And features, of course, a skull design, which was more popular in a more strictly Puritan society. But slate was first used on gravestones in the Boston region in the 1650s. It remained popular in America partially because of its beauty as a stone and its ease of carving, and it aged very well. There's different types of schist, different types of brownstone. There's also different types of slate, of course, and they have different qualities. Around here, you have a lot of schist that is actually almost brown, but that's because there's a lot of iron ore in the schist from this region. And so over hundreds of years, it will oxidize and give it a rust-like pattern. The schist that is in this photo here is from Bolton, which is where the majority of schist was quarried from in the second half of the 17th or 18th century. Now, brownstone is basically prehistoric sandstone that is all over as in the Connecticut River. There's other, of course, sources of brownstone across the Atlantic, including some in New York, New Jersey, etc. But it was first used for any sort of grave markers in the mid-1600s in Windsor, Connecticut by, as we mentioned, the Griswolds. Matthew Griswold was a stonecutter who actually came over from England, and his nephew was a George Griswold, who he taught the trade to. And some of their works dating to the 1650s are still present in cemeteries in the central part, north central part of Connecticut, and a little bit of Springfield region of Mass.
The boards that we have on here, the bottom has already been epoxied and is together with the base. We have the boards, we use it as a brace, and we have clamps. They're ratcheting clamps, so you don't go too tight on it. We don't use screws or anything else. This allows us, for about 7 days, we let it sit there, depending on weather. We never do a repair if it's gonna rain that day. We never do a repair if it's less than 45 degrees. It will react negatively with the epoxy, and that stone needs to be at a nice warm temperature to be able to handle it.